Beneath the fractured pillars of the Parthenon, the wind still carries whispers, echoes of a people who once dared to define what it means to be human. They called themselves Hellenes, children of sunlit seas and stone mountains, dreamers, warriors, philosophers. On a narrow strip of rocky land surrounded by an endless blue, they built a civilization that would outlast empires, kings, and time itself. From the dust of forgotten ages rose Greece. Not the Greece of borders and politics, but of ideas. Democracy, logic, art, freedom. The courage to question gods and men alike. Yet for all their brilliance, they were still human, proud, jealous, fragile. The same fire that illuminated their minds would one day consume their world. This is not merely a story of marble temples and heroic battles. It is the story of ambition, of how a people reached for immortality and how hubris pulled them back to dust. From the warriors of Sparta to the philosophers of Athens, from the shadow of Mycenae to the dawn of Alexander the Great, this is the tale of how Greece rose, shone, and fell. Yet in falling, lit the torch that still burns in every mind that dares to ask why. Empires, historical welcomes you to the story of a civilization that shaped the world, the rise and fall of ancient Greece. Long before the names of Socrates or Pericles echoed across the Aegean, there were other voices, older, quieter, now buried beneath layers of time and myth. They belonged to a people who lived in palaces rather than city-states, who wrote in scripts that have only partly been deciphered, and who carved their gods not on marble but in clay. To understand Greece, we must return to its roots, to Crete and Mycenae, where legend and history were once the same. The island of Crete was the first to awaken. Around 2000 BCE, as Egypt built pyramids and Mesopotamia raised ziggurats, Crete rose from the sea as a maritime kingdom. Its people, the Minoans, named for the mythical king Minos, built labyrinthine palaces at Knossos, Phaistos, and Malea, complexes of corridors and courtyards that seemed to mirror the twisting maze of the Minotaur itself. Walls were painted with dolphins, dancers, and priestesses draped in flowing garments. Here, power did not stand upon spears, but upon commerce, ritual, and the rhythm of the sea. Minoan ships carried olive oil, bronze, and fine pottery to every shore of the Aegean, weaving a web of trade that made the island the beating heart of the eastern Mediterranean. Unlike later empires forged in conquest, the Minoans ruled through influence. Their art lacked the grim violence that would come later with the Mycenaeans. Theirs was a culture of light, open courtyards, airy architecture, a society where women appeared prominently in religious life. Yet even this paradise was not eternal. Around 1600 BCE, a cataclysmic eruption on the island of Thera, modern Santorini, tore through the Aegean. Ash darkened the sky. Tidal waves struck the Cretan coast. Trade faltered, and into that vacuum sailed new masters from the north, the Mynaisa. Wansain Nasrin Zaningar, and Ansars. On the Greek mainland, the Mycenaeans had already begun to rise. Centered at Mycenae, Tiryns, and Pylos, they were a warrior people, proud descendants of Indo-European tribes who had crossed mountains and rivers to claim these lands. If the Minoans built labyrinths for priests, the Mycenaeans built fortresses for kings. Thick walls of stone, Cyclopean, the ancients said, for only giants could have raised them, guarded their citadels. Gold death masks, such as the one found in the tomb of the so-called Agamemnon, gleamed from their graves, proof of wealth wrested from trade, tribute, and war. Their world was smaller, harsher, yet it burned with ambition. From Mycenae's Lion Gate marched heroes who would become legend. Agamemnon, Achilles, Odysseus, names preserved not in stone, but in song. Whether these men truly lived or not, their deeds shaped how later Greeks understood courage, pride, and fate. The Iliad and Odyssey, born from memories of this Bronze Age world, became the spiritual DNA of Greece itself. Every polis, from Athens to Sparta, traced its ideals back to the heroes of Troy, men who fought not for empire, but for honor. By 1400 BCE, Mycenae ruled much of the Aegean. They adopted Minoan writing, Linear B, adapted their art, and expanded across the islands, sending expeditions as far as Asia Minor. Yet the same cycle that would haunt Greek history began even then. Prosperity breeding pride. Pride breeding downfall. Around 1200 BCE, something terrible swept across the Mediterranean. Famine, invasion, internal strife, the mysterious sea peoples. Cities burned, palaces fell silent, writing vanished. The world of heroes collapsed into ash. What followed is called the Greek Dark Age, and for nearly 4 centuries, Greece disappeared from the record. Population shrank, trade ceased. The great palaces of Mycenae and Pylos became ruins, where shepherds grazed their flocks. Yet even in darkness, the ember of civilization did not die. Oral poets wandered from village to village, keeping the memories of gods and heroes alive through song. In the flickering firelight of those forgotten centuries, the foundation of Greek identity, the stories, the values, the longing for glory and meaning, endured. When the light returned around 800 BCE, it shone on a transformed land. The palace kings were gone. In their place rose communities of free citizens, clustered around markets and temples. The Greeks had learned something profound from their own collapse, that power built upon a single man's will is brittle, but power shared among many can endure. From the ashes of Mycenae emerged the first polis, the city-state, a new experiment in human organization and the seed of all that was to come. Yet traces of their ancestors remained everywhere. The myths of Minos and the Minotaur, of Achilles and Agamemnon, were not mere tales. They were cultural memory. When an Athenian stepped into the agora, he carried the blood of those ancient kings. When a Spartan marched to war, he echoed the Mycenaean code of honor. Even the Greek gods, dwelling on Olympus, were shaped by these older deities of sky and storm that the Minoans and Mycenaeans had once worshipped beneath the sun. Thus, before Greece became a civilization of philosophers, it was a civilization of storytellers, people who remembered. They remembered the sea that had both sustained and destroyed them, the gods who could bless or ruin in the same breath, the lesson that greatness demands sacrifice. Out of that memory, the Greeks would build something the world had never seen, a culture that sought not only to survive, but to understand. And so, as dawn rose over the Aegean once more, humanity stood at a threshold. The age of kings and labyrinths was ending. The age of citizens and ideas was about to begin. From the shattered palaces of Knossos and the silent tombs of Mycenae, a voice began to whisper again. The same whisper that still haunts the marble stones of Athens. Know thyself. That whisper would shape the destiny of a people, and through them, the destiny of the world. When the long night of the Dark Age finally lifted, Greece awoke to a new world. The kings of old were gone, their thrones reduced to rubble and their palaces overgrown with wild grass. In their place rose something entirely new, a society without a single ruler, without a central power, yet bound together by common belief, language, and pride. This was the dawn of the polis, the city-state, perhaps Greece's greatest invention, and one of humanity's boldest experiments. The word polis meant more than just city. It was a community, a living organism where every citizen was both ruler and subject, where politics, religion, and identity merged into one. In these compact worlds, Athens, Sparta, Corinth, Thebes, people discovered something revolutionary, the idea that human beings could govern themselves. Unlike the empires of the Near East, where divine kings ruled by decree, the Greeks saw their gods not as masters, but as witnesses. Zeus might hurl lightning, Athena might grant wisdom, but the affairs of men were for men to decide. This new confidence, this belief in human agency, would become the heartbeat of Greek civilization. A new kind of world. The land itself shaped the Greek spirit. Rugged mountains divided the peninsula into isolated valleys. The sea connected them like veins of blue. No single ruler could dominate such fractured terrain. Each polis became a small universe, fiercely independent, often quarrelsome, yet linked by shared ancestry and language. The people were farmers, sailors, traders, poets, warriors, all in one lifetime. They grew olives on stony terraces, built ships to trade with Ionia and Egypt, and met in the agora, the open marketplace that served as the heart of every city. Here they discussed politics, worshipped the gods, bought and sold goods, and argued about the meaning of justice. To live in a polis was not simply to exist, it was to participate. Every man was expected to defend his city, debate its laws, and uphold its honor. Freedom was not a right, it was a duty. Athens and Sparta, two souls of Greece. Among the hundreds of polis that dotted the Aegean world, two would come to define Greece's divided soul: Athens and Sparta. Athens, perched upon its rocky acropolis, was a city of words and ideas. Its power came from its people, farmers, artisans, sailors, and thinkers, who gathered to debate and decide the future of their state. There, in the shadow of the Parthenon, democracy was born. Fragile, imperfect, but revolutionary. The Athenian citizen was not a subject of a king, but a participant in destiny itself. Sparta, by contrast, was a world of silence and steel. Nestled in the valley of the Eurotas River, it had no marble splendor, no philosophers wandering the streets, only discipline. Every Spartan boy was raised to serve the state, every woman to bear its warriors. Freedom here meant duty to the collective. While Athens sought glory through thought and art, Sparta pursued immortality through sacrifice and strength. Two ideals, liberty and order, mind and body, chaos and control, now stood face to face. The tension between them would come to define the drama of Greek history. The Greek Cypriot, Brie. Yet for all their differences, every polis shared a common spirit, what the Greeks called arete, excellence in all things. Whether in war, politics, or art, to be Greek was to strive for greatness, to test the limits of one's ability and courage. In this restless pursuit, they found beauty, tragedy, and meaning. The Olympic Games, first held at Olympia around 776 BCE, embodied this spirit. Here, warriors from rival cities laid down their arms to compete in peace, running, wrestling, throwing, not for money or conquest, but for honor and glory. Victory was seen as a reflection of divine favor, proof that the gods smiled upon human effort. But the Greeks also understood the danger of pride. The word hubris, arrogance before the gods, haunted every triumph. The myths of Icarus and Oedipus, of heroes punished for daring too much, warned that greatness demanded humility. This balance between ambition and restraint, between reaching upward and knowing one's limits, became the moral axis of Greek life, the seeds of empire. As the 8th and 7th centuries BCE unfolded, the Greek world expanded beyond its rugged homeland. Driven by hunger, curiosity, and the call of trade, they launched ships into the unknown. Across the Aegean and beyond, they founded colonies, from Byzantium in the east to Syracuse and Massalia, modern Marseille in the west. Every colony carried its mother city's customs, gods, and dialects, but each was also free, an echo of the polis ideal scattered across the seas. Through this expansion, the Greeks spread not only goods, but ideas. The alphabet, art, architecture, and above all, the conviction that knowledge and debate could shape destiny. The Aegean became a web of culture, a network of independent voices speaking the same language of freedom and pride. Yet beneath that vibrant tapestry lay a question, one that would soon ignite the greatest dramas of Greek history. How could a world of equals ever unite against a greater power? Raging storm. Across the eastern horizon, a new empire was rising, vast, organized, and hungry for dominion. From the plains of Persia would soon march armies larger than any Greece had ever seen, led by kings who claimed to rule by divine right. The scattered city-states, divided by rivalry, would have to choose to stand together for freedom or kneel separately in defeat. The age of the polis had birthed democracy, philosophy, and pride. But soon it would be tested in fire, and from that trial, the world would learn the true meaning of what it meant to be Greek. Across the eastern horizon, beyond the Aegean Sea and the mountains of Anatolia, stretched an empire so vast that the Greeks could scarcely imagine it. From the deserts of Egypt to the plains of India, the Achaemenid Empire of Persia reigned supreme. Its kings commanded legions, its roads spanned continents, and its wealth flowed like rivers of gold. To them, Greece was little more than a scattering of rebellious tribes perched on the edge of the world, a nuisance to be tamed. But to the Greeks, Persia was something else entirely, a test of their courage, their unity, and their idea of freedom itself. For the first time, the scattered city-states would have to stand together against a power that dwarfed them in size, number, and resources. The wars that followed, Marathon, Thermopylae, Salamis, Plataea, would shape not only the fate of Greece, but the very identity of the West. A world divided. The spark was lit in Ionia, on the western coast of Asia Minor. There, Greek colonies thrived under Persian rule, wealthy, restless, and yearning for independence. In 499 BCE, these cities rose in rebellion. The revolt spread quickly, but was brutally crushed. In their desperation, the Ionians called for aid from the mainland. Only Athens and Eretria answered, sending ships across the sea to strike at the Persian stronghold of Sardis. The city burned, and so did Persian pride. King Darius I, the ruler of an empire that spanned 3 continents, swore vengeance. He ordered a servant to whisper in his ear at every meal, "Master, remember the Athenians." Thus began the first Persian invasion of Greece, an empire's retribution against a handful of defiant city-states. The Battle of Marathon. In 490 BCE, Darius sent his army westward, perhaps 25,000 men carried by hundreds of ships, landing on the plain of Marathon, a mere 26 miles from Athens. The Athenians marched out to meet them. 10,000 citizen soldiers, hoplites, each armed with bronze shield and spear, their ranks shining in the sun. They had no cavalry, no archers to match the Persians. What they had was unity. The unbreakable wall of the phalanx. Shoulder to shoulder, shield to shield, they advanced at a run, defying every rule of ancient warfare. When bronze met bronze, the Persian line broke. The invaders fled to their ships, and the Athenians, against all odds, triumphed. It was not merely a battle won, it was an idea proven that free citizens fighting for their homeland could defeat an empire. From that day, Marathon became more than a place. It became a legend, a symbol of human defiance. The runner Phidippides, who carried news of the victory back to Athens, gave his life in the act, inspiring the race that still bears its name. His final words, according to legend, "Rejoice, we are victorious." The return of the empire. But empires do not forget. 10 years later, Darius' son Xerxes gathered the greatest army the world had ever seen. Herodotus claimed it numbered more than 2 million men, perhaps an exaggeration, but vast beyond measure. Bridges of boats were built across the Hellespont. Canals were carved through mountains. The earth itself trembled beneath Persia's march. Against this tidal wave stood a handful of Greek cities, divided as always, some willing to surrender, others to fight. Yet when the storm came, they chose resistance, and at the narrow pass of Thermopylae, the legend was born. Glain awake Naberdani. The Gates of Fire. In 480 BCE, a Spartan king named Leonidas led 300 of his warriors, joined by a few thousand allies, to hold the pass of Thermopylae, the hot gates, where the mountains met the sea. There, for 3 days, they faced the might of Persia. The Persians attacked again and again, their arrows blotting out the sun, their numbers endless. But the Spartans held the line, their discipline and courage turning the narrow pass into a graveyard. Only betrayal ended their stand. A Greek traitor revealed a hidden path through the mountains, allowing Xerxes' troops to outflank them. Knowing death was certain, Leonidas dismissed most of his allies. With his 300 Spartans and a few hundred Thespians and Thebans, he fought to the last. When the final assault came, the Greeks threw away their helmets and fought bareheaded, shouting, "Come and take them!" The Persians prevailed, but Thermopylae was no defeat. It was a message that freedom demanded sacrifice and that courage could echo louder than conquest. Even Xerxes, the conqueror, is said to have honored their bravery. Salamis, the triumph of the sea. While Thermopylae fell, the Greek navy retreated to Salamis, a narrow strait near Athens. There, Themistocles, the cunning Athenian strategist, lured Xerxes into a trap. The massive Persian fleet entered the confined waters where their numbers became a burden. At dawn, as the Persians crowded the strait, the Greek triremes, lighter, faster, deadlier, struck. Oars beat in rhythm, bronze rams splintered hulls, and the cries of battle echoed across the sea. The chaos was total. From his golden throne on a nearby hill, Xerxes watched his fleet burn. The gods, it seemed, had turned against him. By nightfall, the Persian navy was shattered. Without its ships to supply the army, the invasion faltered. Xerxes retreated to Asia, leaving a portion of his troops behind. The next year, at Plataea, the united Greek army delivered the final blow. The Persians were driven from Greece forever. Freedom forged in fire. In victory, the Greeks discovered something profound, that freedom, once defended, becomes sacred. The Persian Wars were more than a clash of nations. They were a contest of ideals between tyranny and liberty, submission and defiance, the command of kings and the voice of the citizen. For the first time in history, a coalition of free states had stood against an empire and prevailed. The aftermath transformed Greece. Athens, having led the naval defense, emerged as the dominant power of the Aegean. From the ashes of war rose the Delian League, a defensive alliance that soon became an Athenian empire in all but name. The city entered an age of wealth and brilliance unmatched in history, an age of philosophers, artists, and architects, of marble temples and democratic debate. But the shadow of hubris loomed once again, for in their triumph the Greeks began to believe they were invincible. The unity forged against Persia would soon fracture into rivalry, envy, and war. Yet for one shining moment, amid the ruins of burnt cities and the songs of heroes, Greece had proven something eternal, that the spirit of a free people, when united, can stand against the might of empires. And the world would never be the same. In the wake of the Persian Wars, Greece stood transformed. The smoking ruins of Athens were rebuilt with marble and pride. The scars of invasion became symbols of resilience, and upon those same stones where despair had once dwelled, a civilization of light was born. This was the golden age of Athens, a brief, blazing moment in history when a single city dared to imagine perfection. Rebirth from ashes. When Xerxes' armies retreated across the Hellespont, Athens lay in ruin. Temples toppled, homes burned, and the sacred Acropolis, once a sanctuary of the gods, was reduced to rubble. Yet the Athenians, led by their visionary statesman Pericles, did not mourn. They built. Stone by stone, they raised a new Athens. not merely a city, but an idea made visible. Under Pericles' leadership, Athens became the heart of Greek civilization, a beacon of democracy, art, philosophy, and power. Pericles spoke of Athens not as a mere polis, but as a school for all of Greece. And in many ways, he was right. From its bustling agora to its gleaming temples, Athens embodied everything the human spirit could aspire to be: rational, creative, and free. But freedom, like light, casts deep shadows. The birth of democracy. The foundations of Athenian democracy had been laid decades earlier by reformers like Solon and Cleisthenes, who broke the power of aristocrats and gave citizens a voice. But under Pericles, that experiment reached its full expression. Every male citizen, regardless of for server. Superbiok, Redethalka, Wayne, Inden and Daindri, the assembly, Reign in Darzal, the ecclesia, where laws were debated and decrees were decided not by kings or priests, but by the people themselves. In the Council of 500, citizens chosen by lot managed the daily affairs of the state. In the courts, juries of hundreds rendered justice by majority vote. It was chaotic, noisy, imperfect, but there would bash some sauks away. So, was alive at all. For the first time, politics became a shared act of creation, not submission. Democracy, however, was not equality. Women, slaves, and foreigners were excluded. Freedom in Athens was a privilege earned by citizenship. A circle drawn tightly around those who bore arms for the city. Yet within that circle, the Athenians discovered something the world had never known: that truth could emerge not from decree, but from debate. Pericles himself captured this spirit in his famous funeral oration. Our Constitution does not copy the laws of neighboring states. We are rather a pattern to others than imitators of them. We alone regard a man who takes no part in public affairs not as harmless, but as useless. It was both an invitation and a warning. In Athens, to live was to participate. The Acropolis and the gods of marble. No symbol captured Athenian greatness like the Acropolis. Rising above the city like a crown of stone, it was rebuilt not as a fortress, but as a monument to beauty and divine harmony. At its center stood the Parthenon, dedicated to Athena, goddess of wisdom, protector of the city, and embodiment of Athenian virtue. Designed by the architects Ictinus and Callicrates, and adorned by the sculptor Phidias, it was a marvel of geometry and proportion. Every column leaned slightly inward. Every line curved almost imperceptibly to correct the illusions of the eye. In marble, the Athenians captured the perfection they sought in thought and life. Inside stood the colossal statue of Athena Parthenos, gold and ivory, serene and eternal. She watched over her people as they debated in the agora, as they launched their ships across the Aegean, as they built a world upon reason. The Acropolis was not just a temple complex, it was a statement, a declaration that man, through art and intellect, could reach toward the divine. Fraudurin. If the Acropolis was Athens's crown, the theater was its heart. Here, in the open air beneath the Attic sky, citizens gathered not merely to be entertained, but to reflect upon the nature of humanity itself. The playwrights Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides transformed myth into mirror, tragedy into truth. Aeschylus, who had fought at Marathon, wrote of justice and divine order, of how pride, hubris, invites the vengeance of the gods. Sophocles, more measured, explored the tension between duty and conscience. In Antigone, a woman defies a king in the name of moral law. Euripides, the skeptic, turned his gaze inward, revealing the madness, jealousy, and longing of mortal hearts. Through these stories, Athens confronted its own soul. Each play was a public act of philosophy, a meditation on fate, choice, and the human cost of greatness. Comedy, too, found its voice in Aristophanes, who mocked politicians and poets alike, turning laughter into criticism, satire into resistance. To attend the theater was not a pastime. It was a civic duty, a moral education. The stage became the conscience of democracy. The age of thought. In this same city, beneath the olive trees and stoa of the agora, philosophy was born. Men like Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle reshaped the way humans understood the world. No longer were truth and virtue handed down by gods or kings. They were sought through reason, dialogue, and doubt. Socrates, the stonemason turned philosopher, roamed the streets asking questions that unsettled the complacent and challenged the powerful. What is justice? What is virtue? How should one live? His weapon was logic, his battlefield the human mind. He left no writings, only disciples, and a legacy that outlived empires. For his refusal to flatter or conform, Athens condemned him to death. As he drank the cup of hemlock, he spoke calmly of the immortality of the soul, proof that philosophy could defy even death. From his martyrdom rose Plato, who dreamed of an ideal world, a realm of perfect forms beyond the imperfections of earth. In his Republic, he imagined a society ruled by wisdom rather than wealth, guided by the pursuit of truth. His student, Aristotle, brought philosophy back to earth. He dissected the world with precision, studying politics, ethics, logic, and nature itself. To him, virtue lay not in extremes, but in balance. We are what we repeatedly do. Excellence, then, is not an act, but a habit. Together, they built the foundations of Western thought, and through them, Athens became not merely a city, but a mind. The empire of the sea. Yet while Athens flourished in art and intellect, its power grew upon the waves. After the Persian Wars, the Delian League had been founded as a defensive alliance of Greek city-states, united against future Persian threats. But over time, Athens transformed it into something else, an empire. The League's treasury, once kept on the sacred island of Delos, was moved to Athens. Tribute from member states flowed in: silver, grain, ships, funding temples, festivals, and the city's fleet of triremes. Pericles used this wealth to beautify Athens and secure its influence. Under his command, the navy ruled the Aegean like a floating wall of democracy. But to other Greeks, especially Sparta, Athens had become arrogant, an imperial power wearing the mask of liberty. What had begun as unity against Persia was slowly turning into rivalry among Greeks themselves. The shadow of hubris. The Athenians believed they were building eternal glory. But their very success carried the seeds of ruin. The same democracy that encouraged debate could turn volatile. The same freedom that inspired genius could descend into chaos. The assembly, swayed by emotion and persuasion, sometimes acted rashly. Demagogues rose, feeding on pride and fear. Pericles himself, for all his wisdom, could not prevent Athens from overreaching. Under his leadership, the city demanded tribute from allies and punished dissent harshly. To many Greeks, Athens no longer stood for freedom. It stood for dominance. And as tension grew between Athens and Sparta, the gods themselves seemed to watch in silence, waiting for the wheel of fate to turn again. The summit of civilization. Yet even amid the gathering storm, Athens reached heights that no city, before or since, has ever matched. In one generation, humanity leapt forward. Architecture, philosophy, history, medicine, and politics all blossomed under the Attic sun. The historian Herodotus chronicled the past not as myth, but as inquiry, the first attempt to understand history as cause and effect. Hippocrates separated medicine from superstition, seeking the nature of disease rather than the wrath of gods. Even the sculptors of Athens seemed to breathe life into stone, capturing not the perfection of gods, but the grace of humanity itself. And so, for a fleeting moment, Athens became a mirror for the best of what humankind could be: free, questioning, creative, flawed, and magnificent. The price of greatness. But the higher the summit, the longer the fall. By the end of the 5th century BCE, the Delian League had become an Athenian empire in all but name. And its former allies began to rebel. Sparta, jealous of Athenian influence, prepared for war. The gods of Olympus, who once smiled upon Greece, now seemed to turn away. The same spirit that had united Greece against Persia was dissolving into mistrust and ambition. In the shadows of the Parthenon, where philosophers once debated virtue and justice, darker voices began to rise. Voices calling for vengeance, power, and dominance. The Golden Age was drawing to a close. The torch that had illuminated the world was beginning to burn too bright, consuming the very city that had kindled it. And soon, from within the cradle of democracy itself, would come a war so devastating that it would shatter Greece forever. The story of Athens, the shining jewel of civilization, had reached its zenith. But history, like the gods of Olympus, demands balance. Every rise must meet its reckoning. And so the Age of Light prepared to descend into the Age of Fire, the Peloponnesian War. There are moments in history when a people rise so high that they touch eternity. For Greece, that eternity was not measured in empires or armies, but in ideas. The Persians had ruled by fear, the Egyptians by divinity. The Greeks, however, chose to rule by thought. In marble, in words, in the quiet pulse of logic and geometry, they built something more enduring than kingdoms. They built the architecture of the human mind. This is the story of that mind, of how Greece, at its peak, turned inward to ask the most dangerous question of all. What does it mean to live well? The awakening of the mind. By the 5th century BCE, Athens had become more than a city. It was an experiment, a living workshop of intellect, creativity, and contradiction. While its empire stretched across the Aegean, its true dominion lay in thought. Philosophers gathered in the agora to argue about justice and beauty. Poets turned the struggles of men into timeless myths. Sculptors carved the divine out of stone with such precision that even silence seemed to breathe. For the first time in history, humans no longer accepted the world as given by the gods. They began to question it. Thales looked at the sea and asked, "What is the substance of all things?" Pythagoras found harmony in numbers, believing the universe itself was music made visible. Anaxagoras proposed that the stars were not divine fires but distant suns. In every observation, the Greeks were doing something radical. They were replacing myth with reason. The cosmos, once ruled by capricious deities, was becoming a place of order, governed by laws that could be known. The rise of humanism. This shift gave birth to the Greek ideal known as humanism, the belief that man, not God, is the measure of all things. To the Greeks, beauty, truth, and virtue were no longer gifts from Olympus. They were pursuits of the human spirit. The sculptors of the classical period, Polykleitos, Phidias, Myron, sought to depict man not as he was, but as he could be. The Discobolus, the Doraphoros, the statues of gods and heroes, all followed the same principle: proportion, harmony, balance. The body became a metaphor for the mind. Every muscle a reflection of self-control, every pose a balance between tension and calm. In this art, the Greeks expressed a truth that would echo through millennia. Perfection lies not in the divine, but in the human striving toward it. Socrates, the philosopher of the streets. Among these seekers of truth walked one man who asked questions so profound that they reshaped the very act of thinking. His name was Socrates. He owned nothing, wrote nothing, and yet became the most dangerous man in Athens. Barefoot and unshaven, he wandered the marketplace, challenging politicians, craftsmen, and generals with questions that pierced their certainty. What is justice? What is virtue? What makes a life worth living? He claimed to know nothing, but through questioning he revealed that most men who thought themselves wise were merely ignorant. His method, the Elenchus, or Socratic dialogue, was simple and revolutionary. Through relentless questioning, truth could emerge not from authority, but from reason. To many, he was a gadfly, a nuisance stinging the complacent city awake. But to others, he was the conscience of Athens itself. When democracy turned paranoid and insecure after years of war, it condemned him to death, accusing him of corrupting the youth and disrespecting the gods. Socrates drank the cup of hemlock with serenity, telling his friends, "The unexamined life is not worth living." His death marked a tragedy, but also a transformation. Philosophy, once the pastime of the curious, had become a moral duty. Plato, the philosopher of the ideal, from Socrates' sacrifice rose his most devoted student. Plato. Where his master had sought truth through questioning, Plato sought it through vision. He founded the Academy, the first true university where men came not to worship gods, but to study the nature of reality itself. Plato believed that the world of senses, the one we touch and see, was only a shadow of a higher, perfect reality. This realm of eternal forms was where true beauty, justice, and goodness existed, pure and unchanging. To him, philosophers were like prisoners freed from a cave who turned from shadows to face the light of truth. In his masterpiece, The Republic, Plato imagined a city governed not by power, but by wisdom, a state led by philosopher kings who sought the good of all, not the wealth of few. His ideas would ripple across centuries, through Rome, Christianity, the Renaissance, and even the Enlightenment. In the Academy's olive groves, thought itself became sacred. Aristotle, the philosopher of the real. But Plato's greatest student would rebel against his teacher. Aristotle, born in Stagira, was a scientist as much as a philosopher. Where Plato gazed at ideals, Aristotle looked at the tangible, the living, breathing world. He walked, observed, dissected, and cataloged. He studied plants, animals, politics, logic, and ethics. He built a vision of knowledge not from heaven down, but from earth up. Aristotle taught that happiness, eudaimonia, was the highest goal, not pleasure or wealth, but a life of reason and virtue. He believed that virtue was a habit, a balance between extremes, courage between cowardice and recklessness, generosity between waste and greed. To Aristotle, the universe was not chaos, but purpose. Everything had an end, a goal, the telos. Now, was to live according to reason. He later became tutor to a young prince from the north, a boy who would one day reshape the world, Alexander of Macedon. The historians, memory and meaning. While philosophers sought truth, others sought to preserve it. The Greeks invented history not as myth or propaganda, but as inquiry, the search for cause and consequence. Herodotus, the father of history, traveled from Egypt to Babylon, recording tales of wars and wonders. Though filled with myth and marvel, his work was united by a single question: why do nations rise and fall? His successor, Thucydides, stripped away myth entirely. Having lived through the Peloponnesian War, he chronicled not divine will, but human ambition, fear, and folly. He wrote, "The strong do what they can, and the weak suffer what they must." With those words, history became tragedy, a mirror to human nature itself. Through their pens, the Greeks taught the world that memory is not enough. Understanding is what endures. Science and the seeds of reason. The Greek mind did not stop at philosophy or politics. It reached into the heavens themselves. Hippocrates, the physician of Kos, separated medicine from superstition. He taught that disease was not divine punishment, but a natural imbalance, and that Observation, not prayer, could heal. The Hippocratic Oath still echoes in the halls of medicine today. Democritus looked at the world and imagined it made of tiny, indivisible particles, atoms, a thought so far ahead of its time that it would take 2,000 years to prove. Euclid, in Alexandria, turned geometry into poetry, a universe of perfect logic built from axioms and proofs. And in Syracuse, Archimedes would later cry, "Eureka!" as he discovered the principles of density and buoyancy, the joy of thought made audible. Through their work, the Greeks made reason divine. They built not temples to gods, but temples of knowledge. The tragic balance. Yet the same brilliance that illuminated Greece also made it fragile. As philosophy questioned the old gods, faith weakened. As democracy celebrated freedom, it grew restless, divided, vulnerable to demagogues. In this world of reason, man stood between heaven and earth, no longer certain of either. The Greek spirit was radiant, but also doomed by its own intensity. Ever-reaching, never content, forever questioning. When Pericles called Athens the school of Hellas, he could not have known how prophetic those words were. For what Athens taught the world, to question, to doubt, to think, would also become the seed of its downfall. Legacy of the mind. By the end of the 5th century BCE, Greece had achieved something no civilization before it had dared. It had turned thought into a form of power. The gods of Olympus began to fade, replaced by the gods of reason and art. Where once Zeus thundered, now Socrates asked. Where once priests ruled, now philosophers debated. From the marble temples to the classrooms of the academy, the Greeks had transformed the act of thinking into an act of faith. A faith not in divinity, but in humanity itself. Their discoveries would echo through every century that followed. In the geometry of Rome, the theology of Christendom, the science of the Renaissance, and the democracies of the modern world. Greece, through its mind, became immortal. But while the Athenian intellect soared, the fragile alliances that had held the Greek world together began to crumble. The city-states that once united against Persia now turned upon one another. Athens, proud and rich. Sparta, disciplined and wary. The gods of reason would soon give way to the madness of war. And as the marble gleam of Athens caught the last light of day, the horizon darkened once again. For genius and pride cannot share the same sky for long. Next would come the war that shattered Greece's heart, the Peloponnesian War, where brother fought brother, and the mind of Greece was consumed by its own brilliance. The marble glimmered, the philosophers spoke, and the theaters overflowed with song, yet beneath the brilliance of Athens, the ground was already cracking. The gods who had once smiled upon Greece began to whisper of hubris, and from the south, Sparta listened. The Peloponnesian War would last nearly 30 years. It was not merely a clash of armies, but a civil war of the Greek spirit. Democracy against discipline, freedom against order, reason against fear. And in the end, it would not be Persia, nor any foreign foe, that destroyed Greece. It would be Greece itself. The uneasy peace. After the Persian Wars, Athens stood at the height of power. Its navy ruled the seas, its empire stretched from the Aegean to the Ionian, and its influence touched every shore. The Delian League, born as an alliance of equals, had become an Athenian dominion. City-states paid tribute not for defense, but for subservience. To Athens, this seemed destiny, the natural reward for sacrifice and brilliance. To Sparta, it was arrogance made flesh. Sparta was everything Athens was not. Landlocked, disciplined, austere. Its people lived not for beauty, but for strength. Not for debate, but for obedience. In the silence of its mountains, Sparta watched Athens' wealth grow and saw corruption spreading like ivy across marble. The tension between them was inevitable. Two visions of life, irreconcilable, standing on the same soil. The historian Thucydides, who lived through the war, wrote, "What made war inevitable was the growth of Athenian power and the fear which this caused in Sparta. Fear, the most ancient of motives, would now drive the most intelligent of civilizations into madness." The first sparks. The first fires began not in Athens or Sparta, but on the edges of their alliances. In Corinth, a powerful naval city allied with Sparta, and in Corcyra, modern Corfu, aligned with Athens, small disputes ignited a chain of retaliation. Soon, the two great powers were drawn in, each defending its pride. By 431 BCE, diplomacy had collapsed. The fragile peace of Greece shattered. Pericles' War. Athens was led by Pericles, the same statesman who had rebuilt the Parthenon and expanded democracy. He knew that Sparta's army was unmatched on land, but Athens ruled the sea. His plan was simple: avoid open battle. Shelter behind the long walls connecting Athens to its port at Piraeus, and use the navy to strike where Sparta could not reach. For a time, it worked. Spartan armies ravaged Attica, burning crops and villages, while Athenians watched from their fortified city, untouchable behind walls of stone. From the harbor, Athenian fleets raided the Peloponnesian coast, spreading fire in return. But what Pericles could not foresee was an enemy no army could fight. As thousands crowded into Athens to escape Spartan raids, a mysterious plague swept through the city. It struck without mercy: soldiers, citizens, priests, and even Pericles himself. Thucydides described it in horror: fevers, thirst, bleeding, madness. The bodies of the dying lay one upon another, he wrote, and half-dead creatures staggered about the streets. 1/3 of Athens perished. The city's discipline, its faith, its humanity, all collapsed. When Pericles died, so too did the restraint that had once guided Athens. The democracy he had nurtured fell prey to demagogues, men who fed the people's anger rather than their wisdom. The greatest city of the mind was now ruled by passion. The age of demagogues. Among the loudest voices to rise after Pericles was Cleon, a merchant who promised victory through aggression. He urged the assembly to punish rebellions harshly, executing men and enslaving women and children in allied cities that dared to resist Athenian rule. The empire that had once fought for freedom now crushed it beneath its triremes. Sparta, sensing opportunity, tightened its alliances. Persian gold, once the enemy's wealth, began to flow into Spartan hands, financing fleets and mercenaries. The balance of power shifted. Athens, brilliant but blinded by pride, refused to see it. The Sicilian expedition. By 415 BCE, Athens had regained some of its strength, but its ambitions had grown monstrous. In the assembly, a young, charismatic general named Alcibiades proposed a daring plan: to sail west, invade Sicily, and conquer Syracuse, the richest Greek city in the Western world. The expedition was massive, over 200 ships, thousands of soldiers, and the hopes of Athens itself. Yet from the beginning, it was cursed. On the eve of departure, religious statues across Athens, the sacred Hermes, were mutilated. Panic spread. Alcibiades was accused of sacrilege and recalled for trial. Fearing execution, he defected, first to Sparta, then later to Persia. Deprived of leadership, the fleet pressed on. In Sicily, it met disaster. The Athenian forces were trapped in the harbor, their ships burned, their men slaughtered or enslaved. Thucydides wrote, "It was the greatest Hellenic action that took place during this war, and the most calamitous to the victors themselves. The dream of empire had devoured its dreamers. Collapse of Athens. The years that followed were a slow, inevitable descent. Athens' allies revolted, its treasury emptied, famine and unrest consumed the city. The once proud citizens who had debated philosophy and justice now fought in the streets for bread. In 404 BCE, after nearly 3 decades of war, Athens surrendered. Its walls were torn down, its fleet reduced to a dozen ships, its empire dissolved. Sparta, the disciplined victor, imposed an oligarchy, the 30 tyrants, ending nearly a century of Athenian democracy. The age of reason had fallen to the age of iron. The cost of civil war. The Peloponnesian War was more than a conflict between cities. It was the suicide of a civilization. Greece, once united in defiance of Persia, lay broken. The polis, the greatest invention of the Greeks, had become their curse. Freedom had turned to faction, debate to demagoguery, courage to cruelty. Thucydides captured the decay of the Greek soul. Words had to change their meanings. Reckless audacity was now considered courage. Prudent hesitation was cowardice. Moderation was weakness. What had begun as a struggle for glory ended in exhaustion. The philosophers kept teaching, the poets kept writing, but the flame that had once illuminated the world flickered. The shadow of Sparta stood triumphant, but victory was hollow. Its rigid system, built on fear and obedience, could not rule a fractured Greece. Within a generation, its power, too, would fade. Persia regained influence through manipulation. The smaller city-states, Corinth, Thebes, Argos, vied for dominance. The unity of Greece was gone forever. Amid this chaos, from the northern hills of Macedon, a new power began to rise. Silent, disciplined, watching. Its young king, Philip II, studied the lessons of the war carefully, the folly of pride, the cost of division, the strength of unity. He vowed that Greece would never again destroy itself from within. And behind Philip stood his son, a boy with the mind of a philosopher and the ambition of a god. Alexander. Epilogue, the end of the classical world. The Peloponnesian War marked the end of the classical age of Greece, the end of its innocence, its confidence, and its belief that wisdom alone could govern man. Yet from the ashes rose understanding. The Greeks had looked into the mirror of war and seen their own reflection, flawed, proud, mortal. What they learned, they passed to the world. That freedom without virtue leads to chaos, that power without wisdom leads to ruin. As the century turned, the once mighty city of Athens became quiet. Its temples still gleamed in the sun, but the laughter of Pericles' Athens was gone. Only the philosophers remained, teaching beneath the olive trees, dreaming of a time when the mind, not the sword, might rule again. Greece had fallen, but her ideas endured, and soon, carried by Macedonian spears and the vision of one extraordinary man, those ideas would conquer the world. The torch had not gone out. It was merely changing hands. When the smoke of war finally cleared, the land of heroes lay silent. The gods no longer thundered over Olympus. The temples still stood, but their marble seemed pale, their prayers unanswered. Greece, once the teacher of freedom, art, and reason, had turned its sword upon itself and paid the price. The Peloponnesian War had ended, but peace did not return. It was not the calm of harmony that followed, but the stillness of exhaustion. A world too tired to dream, too wounded to rise. The age of light was over, the age of shadows had begun. The hollow victory Sparta, the conqueror of Athens, now ruled a broken world. But its triumph was brittle, a crown made of rust. The Spartan ideal, obedience, discipline, and fear, could win wars, but not build peace. Its warriors had spent their lives training for battle. They knew how to conquer, not how to govern. The Helots, enslaved beneath them, simmered with resentment. The allies who had followed Sparta against Athens soon turned away, realizing that the new master was harsher than the old. Sparta imposed oligarchies upon defeated cities, but tyranny breeds rebellion. The Greeks, who had once united to defend freedom, now lived under a boot of their own making. Within a decade, revolts erupted from Corinth to Thebes. Persia, the ancient enemy, re-entered Greek affairs. not with armies, but with gold, buying loyalty, sowing division. By 395 BCE, Greece was again at war, the Corinthian War, a chaotic struggle where old allies traded sides like merchants in the Agora. Sparta fought Athens, Thebes, Corinth, and Argos, while Persia supplied whichever side seemed weakest, ensuring no Greek city would rise again to threaten its empire. The once noble ideal of Hellas united had turned to dust. Athens reborn, but not renewed Athens, against all odds, recovered some of its strength. The democracy restored itself, fleets were rebuilt, and philosophers returned to their schools. But the city had changed. The grandeur of Pericles' Athens was gone, replaced by pragmatism and cynicism. The empire that once spoke of liberty now sought only survival. When Sparta faltered, Athens allied with old enemies to regain influence, forming the Second Athenian League in 377 BCE. But this alliance was hollow, a shadow of its former glory, held together by fear rather than faith. The tribute ships returned to Piraeus, but the songs of triumph were replaced by the clinking of coins. Democracy itself had decayed. The citizens, weary of politics, were easily swayed by orators who promised simple answers to complex problems. The philosophers warned of decline, but few listened. Plato, in his later years, lamented that democracy had become a market of desires, where the people chased pleasure instead of virtue, and where the crowd crowned fools as kings. He wrote the Republic as both a dream and a warning, a vision of an ideal society ruled by wisdom set against the chaos of his own time. The rise of Thebes. While Athens rebuilt and Sparta decayed, a new power began to stir in the plains of Boeotia. Thebes. For centuries, Thebes had been overshadowed by its rivals, mocked as indecisive and dull. But in the aftermath of the Peloponnesian War, it rose with quiet determination and one of the finest generals Greece would ever know, Epaminondas. Epaminondas was unlike other commanders. He was a philosopher warrior, a disciple of Pythagorean thought, who saw geometry and harmony in the movement of armies. He trained his men not just to fight, but to think, to move as one living organism upon the field. At the Battle of Leuctra in 371 BCE, Thebes shattered the myth of Spartan invincibility. Epaminondas reformed the traditional phalanx, deepening its ranks and focusing all power on one flank. The Spartan line broke. For the first time in centuries, a Spartan king was slain in battle. Greece gasped. The unbreakable had been broken. But even Thebes, at its moment of glory, could not unite the Greek world. Epaminondas was killed in 362 BCE at Mantinea, his final words both triumphant and tragic. "I leave Greece two daughters, Leuctra and Mantinea. They were victories, yes, but also tombstones. With his death, Thebes' brief flame went out, a fractured world. By the middle of the 4th century BCE, Greece was a patchwork of weary states, each proud, each distrustful, each clinging to the ghosts of its former greatness. Athens still dreamed of democracy. Sparta clung to the memory of discipline. Thebes longed for its brief ascendancy, but none could see beyond their borders. The philosophers debated virtue in the academies, while mercenaries fought for silver in endless border skirmishes. Temples stood empty, and the people turned from gods to gold. The word Hellas, once sacred, now meant little more than geography. The north watches beyond the mountains of Thessaly, in a rugged land called Macedon. A young kingdom watched and learned. To the Greeks, Macedonians were half barbarians, rough, provincial, speaking a dialect barely worthy of the name Greek. But Macedon had something the city-states lacked: unity. King Philip II, educated in Thebes during his youth, had studied the failures of Greece as carefully as he studied its victories. He understood that brilliance without discipline is weakness, and freedom without purpose is ruin. He took the lessons of Sparta's army and Athens' strategy, forged them together, and added something new: vision. While the Greek cities quarreled, Philip trained his soldiers, reformed the phalanx, and built the most efficient military machine Greece had ever seen. His army carried long sarissas, spears twice the length of traditional ones, forming an impenetrable wall of death. He created a system of engineers, cavalry, and logistics that could move as swiftly as a thought. But most importantly, he wielded diplomacy as deftly as the sword. He played the city-states against one another, offering peace to one while waging war upon another. Each victory was followed not by destruction, but by alliance. Until, one by one, the proud cities of Greece became his pawns. The last stand of the free Greeks. In 338 BCE, Athens and Thebes, ancient rivals, finally realized too late the danger that loomed from the north. They set aside centuries of enmity to face Philip together at Chaeronea. The battle was fierce, fought beneath a burning sun and the eyes of history. On the Macedonian left flank, a young prince, Alexander, barely 18, led the cavalry. When the Greek line faltered, he struck like lightning, cutting through Theban ranks and breaking their sacred band, the elite corps of lovers and warriors who had sworn to die side by side. By dusk, the field was silent. The flower of Greek freedom lay in blood. Greece was no longer master of itself. Philip called it unity. Others called it conquest. Either way, the long dream of the independent polis was over. The end of the polis. The polis maites, that fragile miracle of self-rule born after the Dark Age, had given the world democracy, philosophy, and art. But it could not survive the weight of its own divisions. Each city had been a universe, proud and separate. Now they were provinces beneath the Macedonian crown. Athens still had its schools and orators, but its power was gone. Sparta was a relic, Thebes a ruin. The age of citizens had ended. The age of kings was about to begin. Echoes of a broken world. And yet, even in defeat, Greece triumphed in a way no conqueror could erase. Its mind, its spirit, had already conquered the world of ideas. The philosophers still taught. The sculptors still carved. And in the heart of Macedon, a young conqueror listened to both. Alexander would soon march east, carrying with him not just swords and banners, but the inheritance of Greece itself, its reason, its art, its restless fire. The polis had fallen, but the idea of Greece would outlive empires. The torch, though flickering, had not gone dark. For even as Greece divided, its spirit prepared to rise again. This time, upon the shoulders of a single man who believed he could unite not just Hellas, but the world. And his name was Alexander. For more than a century, the city-states of Greece had bled one another dry, brilliant, proud, and blind. Each clung to its autonomy like a crown of thorns. Each believed itself eternal. But beyond the mountains of the north, in a kingdom the Greeks once mocked as barbaric, a man was quietly forging the future. His name was Philip II of Macedon. And he would accomplish what no Athenian or Spartan ever could, the unification of Greece, not through ideals or debate, but through steel, strategy, and vision. The land of the North Macedonia was not like the other Greek lands. Its mountains were wild, its people rough, its kings both warriors and diplomats. The Macedonians spoke a dialect the Southerners considered crude, and they lived closer to nature, to the old heroic code of Homer than to the reasoned politics of Athens. Yet this rugged land held an advantage: unity. While the city-states were fracturing under the weight of freedom, Macedonia remained a monarchy, disciplined and pragmatic. Its wealth came not from trade or marble, but from timber, horses, and iron, the raw materials of war. From these elements, Philip would forge a new world. The education of a king born in 382 BCE, Philip spent part of his youth as a hostage in Thebes, then the most powerful city in Greece. But captivity became his education. There he studied the tactics of Epaminondas, the Theban general who had destroyed the Spartan phalanx through cunning and precision. Philip learned what made Greece both magnificent and fragile. Its intellect, its independence, its fatal disunity. When he returned to Macedonia after his brother's death, he inherited a kingdom on the verge of collapse. Enemies pressed from all sides, the nobles were divided, and the army was little more than an unruly mob. Most men would have despaired. Philip began to build. The reformer of armies. His genius was not just in battle, but in organization. He restructured the Macedonian army into the most advanced military machine the ancient world had ever seen. The heart of this force was the Macedonian phalanx, a refinement of the old Greek formation. Philip armed his soldiers with the sarissa, a spear nearly 6 meters long, twice the reach of the traditional hoplite's weapon. When 16 men stood side by side, their overlapping spears created a living wall of spikes, an unstoppable engine of death. Behind the phalanx marched engineers, supply units, siege specialists, and cavalry. Philip turned war into science, but he was more than a general. He was a statesman who understood the psychology of conquest. He preferred diplomacy before destruction, bribery before blood. Where Athens and Sparta had ruled through fear or pride, Philip ruled through calculation. He sent gold where he could not send soldiers, and alliances where he could not win trust. The Greeks called it corruption. Philip called it strategy, the unifier of Greece. One by one, the Greek city-states fell under his influence. He took Amphipolis, Pydna, and Potidaea from Athens, not through grand battles, but through speed and surprise. He courted Thessaly, subdued Illyria, and married into neighboring dynasties to secure borders without war. Each campaign was not just conquest, it was consolidation. By the 340s BCE, Athens began to realize the scale of the threat. The great orator Demosthenes warned his people in his Philippics that Philip is no ordinary man, he is the relentless hand of fate itself. But Athens, divided and indecisive, hesitated. The same democracy that had once defied Persia could now barely agree on defense budgets. Philip moved swiftly. In 338 BCE, the city-states of Greece made one last desperate attempt to stop him. Athens and Thebes, rivals for generations, united their armies and met the Macedonians at Chaeronea. The battle would decide the fate of Hellas. The Battle of Chaeronea. The day was hot, the air thick with dust and dread. The Athenian phalanx held the left, the Thebans the right, and between them marched men who carried centuries of Greek pride. Facing them was the army Philip had forged, disciplined, silent, immovable. On the left flank stood Philip himself, directing the infantry with masterful patience. On the right, commanding the cavalry, was his son, Alexander, just 18 years old. Philip feigned retreat, drawing the Athenian line forward, breaking its perfect formation. When the gap opened, Alexander struck. With the companion cavalry, elite horsemen armed with lances, he pierced through the Theban ranks and shattered the sacred band, the invincible core that had once humbled Sparta. The Greek army broke. At sunset, the field of Chaeronea was silent, strewn with the fallen dreams of liberty. Philip, victorious, walked among the dead and whispered, "Hey, Hellas is won, and I am her shepherd." He did not destroy Athens. He knew that its intellect would serve him better alive than buried. Instead, he offered peace under Macedonian leadership. The League of Corinth. In 337 BCE, Philip summoned all the Greek city-states to Corinth, where he established the League of Corinth, the first political union of Greece in history. Each polis retained its local government, but all swore allegiance to a single cause: unity under Macedon. Philip declared himself hegemon, supreme leader, and announced his grand ambition: to lead a pan-Hellenic campaign against Persia, to avenge the invasions of Darius and Xerxes once and for all. It was a masterstroke. To the Greeks, he offered pride and purpose. To himself, he gained legitimacy and a reason to extend his empire eastward. For the first time, after centuries of rivalry and war, Greece stood under one banner, not by choice, but by necessity. And, for the first time, that banner pointed beyond the Aegean. The death of Philip. But fate, ever envious of ambition, intervened. In 336 BCE, as Philip celebrated the marriage of his daughter Cleopatra in the theater of Aegae, he entered unarmed, radiant in his triumph. The crowd roared. The music rose. And then, from the shadows, came a dagger. The assassin, one of his own bodyguards, Pausanias, struck him through the heart. Philip II of Macedon, unifier of Greece, fell before his dream was fulfilled. He died at 46, a soldier, a king, and perhaps the most cunning mind of his age. The Greeks rejoiced in secret, thinking his death might free them. They were wrong, for standing beside his fallen father was a young man who would not only complete Philip's dream, but expand it beyond imagining, a man with the discipline of a Spartan, the intellect of an Athenian, and the fire of Achilles, Alexander, the heir to destiny. In that moment of blood and chaos, the torch passed from one generation to the next. Alexander was just 20 years old, but he had been preparing for this all his life. He had been taught by Aristotle, schooled in logic, science, and philosophy. He had ridden into battle beside his father, learning strategy and command. He had read Homer until he could quote the Iliad from memory, sleeping with a copy beneath his pillow and dreaming himself a new Achilles. When he took the throne, the Greek world trembled once more, but not from rebellion. They had seen what his eyes carried: the calm of genius and the hunger of conquest. Philip had united Greece. Alexander would lead it to immortality. The dawn of a new era. Thus ended the story of Greece as a divided land and began its transformation into something larger, an idea that would stretch from the Aegean to the edges of the known world. The philosophers had sought truth. The poets had sought beauty. The generals had sought glory. Now, through Alexander, Greece would seek eternity. The polis was dead, but its spirit would march on, carried not by citizens, but by legions. Through one man's ambition, the thought of Socrates and the art of Phidias would travel farther than they ever had before. The rise of Macedonia was not merely the fall of Greece's independence. It was the rebirth of its destiny. For from the hills of Macedon, under the banner of one king and one dream, the Greek world would soon awaken again, not as a cluster of city-states, but as a civilization that would reshape the earth. The age of philosophers was giving way to the age of conquerors. And in its first dawn stood a name that would echo for all time: Alexander the Great. When Philip II fell to an assassin's blade, the torches of Macedonia burned through the night. From the palace to the plains, whispers of rebellion spread. Athens rejoiced too soon. Thebes armed in secret, and distant satraps muttered that the northern kingdom would collapse without its architect. But at dawn, a single figure stepped forth, calm, young, unshaken. He was 20 years old, and already he bore the gravity of empire in his eyes. Alexander, son of Philip and student of Aristotle, now king of Macedon and master of Greece. The world did not yet know it, but it stood on the edge of transformation. The shadow of the father. The first act of a new monarch is survival. When word of Philip's death spread, Greece erupted in hope and defiance. Thebes declared independence, Athens prepared to follow, and the Macedonian nobles themselves hesitated. But Alexander moved with lightning. Within days, he crushed rebellion among his own ranks, executing rivals and securing the loyalty of his army. Then, with brutal efficiency, he marched south into Greece. A king in motion, his armor still gleaming from the coronation. At the gates of Thebes, the same city that had once tutored his father, he offered mercy, surrender, and peace. They refused. Alexander leveled the city. Thebes, cradle of Epaminondas, home of the sacred band, was erased from the earth. Only the temples and the house of Pindar the poet were spared. Greece understood the message. The age of argument was over. The age of destiny had begun. The dream of conquest. Philip had dreamed of invading Persia. Alexander would make that dream his life's mission. To the Greeks, Persia was more than an enemy. It was a specter of tyranny, the ancient giant that had once sought to enslave Hellas. In 334 BCE, Alexander crossed the Hellespont with 40,000 men, Macedonians, Thessalians, Greeks united under his banner. Before stepping onto Asian soil, he halted at the tomb of Achilles. Kneeling upon the dust of Troy, he prayed to his hero and declared, "I will make my deeds greater than yours." It was not arrogance, it was prophecy. Battle of Granicus. The Persian satraps met him at the river Granicus, their cavalry glittering beneath the Anatolian sun. Alexander's generals urged caution. The river was steep, the current swift, the enemy entrenched. He charged anyway. With the companion cavalry at his side, Alexander plunged into the torrent, spears breaking, shields shattering. A Persian officer nearly struck him down, but Clytus, his friend, his brother-in-arms, cut the man's arm off before the blade could fall. When the dust settled, Persia's first defense was broken. The young Macedonian king stood drenched in blood and victory. Asia, the endless frontier of myth, now lay open. The fall of Darius. From the Aegean coast to the heart of Anatolia, city after city opened its gates. The Persian king, Darius III, gathered the full might of his empire and met Alexander at Issus in 333 BCE. The battle was chaos, a storm of dust, steel, and shouting. The Persian army dwarfed Alexander's, but its sheer size became its weakness. The Macedonian phalanx advanced like a machine, and the cavalry, led by Alexander himself, cut straight for Darius's chariot. For the second time in history, the great king of Persia fled before the Greeks. His family was captured, but Alexander treated them with honor. To the Queen Mother, he said, "You have nothing to fear. Darius lives in me now." The conqueror was becoming something more than a general. So for one was, offer proud and nothemble a myth in motion. The lord of Egypt after Issus, Alexander turned south. He marched into Phoenicia, took Tyre after a brutal 7-month siege, and crushed Gaza, the last Persian stronghold before Egypt. When he entered Memphis in 332 BCE, the Egyptians hailed him not as a conqueror, but as a liberator. He visited the temples of the gods and was crowned Pharaoh, son of Amun, divine by decree. In the desert of Siwa, he journeyed alone to the oracle of Amun-Ra. What words passed between the god and the king are lost to time, but when he emerged, his gaze had changed. He began to speak of himself not just as king of men, but as chosen of the gods, a bridge between mortal and divine. Before leaving Egypt, he founded a new city at the mouth of the Nile, Alexandria, destined to become the lighthouse of the world, a beacon of Greek thought for centuries to come, the heart of Asia. From Egypt, Alexander turned east once more. In 331 BCE, he met Darius again, this time at Gaugamela, near modern-day Mosul. The Persian king had gathered an army said to number 1 million men. The plain was wide, open, perfect for Persian cavalry. Alexander surveyed it in silence. Then, with the confidence of a god, he advanced. When Darius's chariots charged, Alexander's men opened their ranks, letting the horses pass harmlessly through before closing in again. Then, spotting a weakness in the Persian center, Alexander led the cavalry straight into the gap. the great king fled once more, his empire shattered behind him. The world's oldest monarchy had fallen to a boy from Macedon. Alexander entered Babylon, Susa, and at last, Persepolis, the jewel of Persia. There in the Palace of Kings, he faced a choice, vengeance or restraint. He chose both. After feasting with his men, he ordered the city burned, an offering to the gods of Hellas for Xerxes' invasion of Athens. As the flames consumed the marble halls, he watched in silence, a conqueror lit by his own destruction. The conqueror becomes the god. In the years that followed, Alexander moved deeper into the heart of Asia. Thribe, Bactria, Sogdiana, across rivers whose names even the Greeks had never heard. Each step took him farther from the world that had made him. He began to wear Persian robes, adopt Persian customs, and demand proskynesis, the act of kneeling before him. To his Macedonian officers, this was sacrilege. To Alexander, it was destiny. He saw himself not merely as king of Greece or Persia, but as ruler of the world, a man who could unite East and West. But the gods are jealous of mortals who reach too high. When his friend Clytus, the same man who had once saved his life, mocked him for claiming divinity, Alexander Dvencheskar, drunk and furious, struck him dead. As the body fell, the conqueror who had defeated empires wept like a child. It was the first crack in the armor of the god king. Beyond the edge of the world still he marched. Through the snows of the Hindu Kush, through jungles and rivers no Greek had ever seen. At Hydaspes, in India, he faced King Porus, whose elephants towered over the battlefield. The rain turned the ground to mud. The elephants crushed men beneath their feet. But Alexander's will was iron. When victory came, he asked Porus how he wished to be treated. The Indian king replied, "As a king." Alexander smiled. "So shall it be." He appointed Porus as satrap, one king honoring another. But when he declared his intent to push farther east toward the unending dawn, his army refused. They had crossed half the known world and could go no farther. At the Hyphasis River, Alexander wept, not for defeat, but for the realization that even gods have limits. The death of a god. He turned back. Through the desert of Gedrosia, men died by the thousands. Yet Alexander pressed on, leading from the front, sharing his soldiers' hunger and thirst. By the time he returned to Babylon, he was 32 years old, master of Greece, Egypt, Persia, and half of India. He had conquered more of the world than any man before him, but peace eluded him still. Plans for new conquests, Arabia, Africa, even Rome, filled his thoughts, but then suddenly he fell ill. Fever gripped him, his voice failed. The empire he had built watched helplessly as its god lay dying. When his generals asked to whom he left his empire, he whispered, "To the strongest." And so, in 323 BCE, Alexander of Macedon, called the Great, the conqueror of the world, the son of Zeus Ammon, died. He was 33. Legacy of fire. In 11 years, Alexander had destroyed an empire and created another. He had spread Greek language, art, and science across continents. From the Mediterranean to the Indus, cities bore his name, temples his likeness, and philosophy his breath. But the unity he dreamed of died with him. His generals, the Diadochi, carved the empire into kingdoms: Ptolemies in Egypt, Seleucids in Asia, Antigonids in Macedonia. From their rivalries would rise the Hellenistic age, when Greek thought would mingle with Eastern spirit, an age of invention, reason, and wonder, born from conquest and chaos alike. Alexander had sought immortality. He found it, not in empire, but in influence. For though he died a man, he left behind a world remade in the image of Greece, a world that would give birth to Rome, to philosophy, to science, and to the very idea of civilization itself. The boy from Macedon had become what even the gods could envy: eternal. Alexander was gone, but his shadow stretched farther than his empire ever had. From Egypt to India, men spoke of him as more than mortal, as a bridge between gods and men, between East and West. Yet his death left behind not unity, but an inheritance of chaos. The man who had dreamed of a single world left it shattered into many. But even as his empire fractured, his idea, Greece itself, kept marching on. The empire. Without a king. When Alexander died in Babylon in 323 BCE, he left behind no heir capable of ruling his vast dominion. His only legitimate son, Alexander IV, was an infant. His generals, hardened by war and ambition, refused to serve as guardians to a baby. Instead, they turned their swords upon one another. These were the Diadochi, the successors, men who had once followed Alexander across deserts and oceans, now consumed by his throne. Ptolemy took Egypt, shrewd and patient, carrying Alexander's body to Alexandria and laying him in a golden sarcophagus, a relic to legitimize his rule. Seleucus claimed the heart of Asia, from Babylon to Persia, creating the vast Seleucid Empire. Antigonus and his son Demetrius seized Macedonia and Greece itself. Lysimachus and Cassander fought for the scraps of Anatolia and Thrace. Each wore the title of Basileus, king. Though none possessed Alexander's soul, their wars, which lasted for generations, painted the earth red with the blood of former brothers. Cities burned, alliances shifted like sand, and for the first time, the Greeks discovered what it meant to rule lands too vast to understand. Yet even amid this turmoil, something remarkable was happening. The Hellenistic world, a civilization that carried Greek thought into the farthest reaches of the known earth. The new Greece, cities of the world. Wherever Alexander had marched, cities bearing his name had risen. Alexandria in Egypt, in Syria, in Bactria, in the Caucasus, in India. These were not colonies in the old sense. They were living embassies of Greek culture, outposts of reason in lands of tradition. In these new cities, Greek settlers mingled with Egyptians, Persians, Jews, and Indians. They married, traded, and exchanged ideas. Sculptors blended Greek realism with Eastern symbolism. Philosophers translated Plato into Aramaic. Astronomers mapped the stars with Babylonian precision and Greek logic. The world was becoming cosmopolitan, a fusion of East and West, body and spirit, knowledge and myth. At the center of this new age stood Alexandria in Egypt, the jewel of the Hellenistic world. Founded by Alexander, perfected by the Ptolemies, it became a city of marble streets and golden harbors. Its lighthouse, the Pharaohs, one of the 7 wonders of the world. But greater than its monuments was its mind. The Library of Alexandria, built beside the royal palace, sought to gather every book, scroll, and idea under the sun. Here, scholars from every land studied under one roof: Greeks, Egyptians, Syrians, Hebrews, Persians, even Indians. They measured the earth, dissected the human body, debated the movement of the heavens. In those halls, Euclid wrote the Elements, defining the geometry of the universe. Eratosthenes calculated the circumference of the earth with astonishing accuracy. Archimedes, from Syracuse, played with numbers and water, shouting "Eureka!" as if discovering the joy of creation itself. For a moment, knowledge became the new conquest, truth, the new empire. The spread of Greek thought. As Greek language and culture spread, so too did its philosophy. The questions once asked in the Agora of Athens now echoed from Egypt to Afghanistan. But in this new world, vast, uncertain, and filled with longing, philosophy changed. It became not a public debate, but a personal refuge. From the ruins of the old city-states arose new schools of thought. Stoicism, founded by Zeno of Citium, taught that happiness came not from wealth or power, but from living in harmony with reason and nature. The universe, said Zeno, is one great city, and we are its citizens. Epicureanism, from Epicurus, taught argued the opposite, that peace came from pleasure, not indulgence, but the quiet joy of friendship and freedom from fear. When we are, death is not, and when death is, we are not. Skepticism, from Pyrrho, warned against certainty itself, teaching that wisdom begins in doubt. The restless mind of Greece had finally turned inward, seeking not conquest, but serenity. After centuries of striving to master the world, the Greeks were learning to master themselves. Art of the Hellenistic soul. In sculpture and art, too, the Hellenistic age found new depth. Gone were the idealized forms of the classical period, those serene gods and perfect athletes carved in timeless calm. Now came emotion, movement, and humanity. The Laocoon group, twisting in agony as serpents crushed father and sons. The winged victory of Samothrace, caught forever in the moment between flight and triumph. The Venus de Milo, beautiful not in perfection but in imperfection, her missing arms, her unfinished grace, her silent mystery. In these works, the Greeks had rediscovered what they had once forgotten, that beauty is not only in balance, but also in struggle. The Hellenistic artist no longer sought the divine in form, he sought it in feeling. The kingdoms of the successors. While art and philosophy flourished, the empires of the successors grew decadent. The Ptolemies ruled Egypt as living gods, blending Greek intellect with Egyptian ritual. The Seleucids, ruling from Antioch and Babylon, commanded vast lands but could never tame their diversity. The Antigonids held Macedonia and Greece, their power fading with each generation. Trade flowed across their borders, spices from India, silk from China, gold from Nubia, yet behind the splendor was instability. Each kingdom depended on Greek colonists and mercenaries, yet the native populations remained restless. It was a world glittering on the surface, fragile beneath. And in the West, a new power was stirring, pragmatic, disciplined, and hungry. Rome. The Greek mind meets the Roman sword. By the 2nd century BCE, Rome had risen from a small Italian republic to a Mediterranean force. The Greek kingdoms, weakened by internal wars, became its stepping stones. In 197 BCE, Rome defeated Macedon at Cynocephalae, the phalanx shattered by the flexibility of Roman legions. By 168 BCE, the last Macedonian king was captured, and in 146 BCE, Corinth, once the jewel of Hellas, was burned to the ground. Greece, the mother of civilization, had fallen again, this time not to arrogance, but to fatigue. Yet the conquerors did not erase her. They revered her. The Romans conquered Greece with the sword. Greece conquered Rome with the mind. The immortal legacy. From this fusion, Greek intellect and Roman power, the Western world was born. The language of philosophy, of science, of art remained Greek. The gods of Olympus became the architecture of Roman religion. The writings of Plato and Aristotle shaped the minds of emperors and theologians. Even as political Greece vanished, cultural Greece became eternal. When the Roman poet Horace wrote, "Captive Greece took her savage conqueror captive," he spoke the truth of history, that ideas once born cannot be chained. The Hellenistic world had ended, but its essence endured. In every law written, every theorem proved, every question asked in the centuries to come. Epilogue. The Empire of the Mind. Alexander had sought to unite the world through conquest. He failed. But the philosophers, artists, and dreamers who came after him succeeded in another way. They united humanity through thought. They taught that the same stars shine over all lands, that reason and virtue belong to no nation, and that beauty, like truth, needs no borders. The Hellenistic age began with blood, but ended with brilliance. It was the bridge between the ancient and the modern, between myth and man, between the sword and the mind. And though the marble temples would crumble and empires rise and fall, the echo of Greece would never fade. For the true empire of Greece was not of land or kings or armies. It was the empire of the human spirit, eternal and unconquered. The torch of Hellas had passed from the hands of conquerors to the hearts of thinkers. And in that flame, the world, though forever changed, found its light. When the Roman legions trampled through Corinth in 146 BCE, they did not merely end a war, they closed an age. The last free city of Greece had fallen. The marble columns that once glimmered under the Athenian sun now cast shadows under Roman eagles. Yet the conquest was paradoxical. Though Rome ruled Greece, Greece ruled Rome's soul. From this union, the sword and the mind, would be born the civilization of the West, carrying the flame of Hellas across centuries, empires, and faiths. The Roman captors, the Greek teachers. To the Romans, Greece was, at first, a trophy, a conquered land filled with art, temples, and slaves. But soon they realized they had conquered not barbarians, but their own teachers. Roman youth were sent to Athens to study rhetoric and philosophy. Generals collected Greek statues and scrolls as treasures of refinement. Greek tutors filled Roman villas, teaching logic, ethics, and the art of persuasion to the sons of senators. Cicero, the greatest orator of Rome, would later admit, "It is from Greece that we have learned all the arts and sciences." In their libraries, Romans read Plato and Aristotle. In their temples, they renamed the gods. Zeus became Jupiter, Aphrodite became Venus, Ares became Mars. But the myths remained the same. The language of power became Latin, but the language of thought remained Greek. Rome might rule the world, but Greece still ruled the mind of man. The Baulidaftain Sensentas. This fusion created something unprecedented, a civilization that combined Greek intellect with Roman order. Philosophy gained structure, law gained reason. Stoicism, born in the Hellenistic age, became the creed of Roman virtue. Seneca, Epictetus, and even Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor, echoed the teachings of Zeno. Waste no more time arguing what a good man should be. Be one. Greek rationalism found new purpose in Roman pragmatism. Where Plato dreamed of ideal republics, the Romans built them. Where Aristotle studied constitutions, the Romans codified them. The empire itself became a living reflection of Greek philosophy. Order imposed upon chaos, reason upon passion. And in this new order, Greek science flourished again. Ptolemy charted the stars. Galen mapped the human body. In the libraries of Alexandria and Pergamon, scholars preserved the legacy of centuries. Even as armies rose and fell, knowledge endured, a quiet rebellion against time. The coming of a new faith. Yet as the world grew more rational, it also grew more restless. The old gods, beautiful, immortal, capricious, no longer spoke to a people weary of empire and decay. Into this silence came a new voice, not Greek, not Roman, but born in the eastern shadows of the Hellenistic world. A faith that promised not glory, but salvation. Not immortality through memory, but eternal life through love. Christianity. It found its earliest disciples in Greek-speaking lands, in Antioch, in Ephesus, in Corinth. The New Testament was written not in Latin, but in Koine Greek, the common tongue of the Hellenistic world. Paul, the apostle of the nations, carried his message through the old trade routes of Alexander, preaching in cities built by Macedonian kings. The first Christian theologians were Greeks, Clement of Alexandria, Origen, Basil the Great, and they clothed the new faith in the garments of philosophy. The Logos, the Word of God, became a bridge between faith and reason. Thus, the divine returned to Greece, not as Zeus upon Olympus, but as Christ upon the cross. The fall of Rome, the survival of Greece. As the centuries turned, the Roman Empire stretched too far, too thin. Barbarians pressed at its borders. Corruption ate its heart, and the once mighty legions faltered. But in the East, in the ancient lands of Alexander and Aristotle, a new empire rose from the ashes of the old. Its name was Byzantium, centered in Constantinople, the new Rome, built upon Greek soil. It spoke Greek, prayed in Greek, and thought in Greek. Here, the traditions of Plato mingled with the theology of Christ. The emperors crowned by bishops ruled in the name of both Caesar and God. In marble churches adorned with mosaics of gold, the philosophers of old seemed to whisper again. Not of logic or geometry, but of divine order and eternal light. While the West plunged into darkness, the Byzantine Empire kept the lamp of knowledge burning. From its schools came the scribes who copied Aristotle, the theologians who debated the nature of the soul, and the diplomats who taught Rome's heirs how to govern with cunning and grace. For 1,000 years, Byzantium was Greece reborn in Christian form, the mind of Hellas baptized in the waters of faith. The second death of Greece. But even empires built on wisdom cannot escape decay. In 1453, the walls of Constantinople trembled under Ottoman cannons. The last Byzantine emperor, Constantine XIII, fought upon the ramparts like a Homeric hero reborn. When the city fell, so too did the last living remnant of ancient Greece. The Hagia Sophia became a mosque, its golden dome echoing prayers in a new tongue. Yet even then, the flame did not die. The scholars of Byzantium fled west, carrying with them their manuscripts, the works of Plato, Euclid, Ptolemy, and Aristotle. They arrived in Italy, in Florence, and Venice, and there their words sparked another dawn, the Renaissance, the third life of Greece. In the studios of Florence, painters rediscovered anatomy and proportion, the language of Polyclitus and Phidias. In the workshops of inventors, geometry returned to motion. The symmetry of the Parthenon echoed in the domes of Brunelleschi. In the minds of scholars, philosophy awoke once more, now called humanism, the rebirth of the belief that man, not God, is the measure of all things. The manuscripts carried by Greek refugees became the seeds of Western thought. From them, Copernicus learned to challenge the heavens, Galileo learned to see, Newton learned to reason. The Greeks had once taught that truth lay in numbers and proportion. Now, science would prove them right. The Renaissance was not merely the revival of art, it was the resurrection of Greece itself. The immortal flame. Across millennia, Greece had died many deaths. To set a Sparta's sword, to Rome's legions, to Ottoman cannons, and yet it always returned. Because Greece was never just a place, it was an idea of beauty, of balance, of thought. When men question, when artists seek harmony, when citizens debate justice, Greece lives again. Its spirit flows not in marble or empire, but in the courage to ask why. From Homer to Aristotle, from Alexander to Byzantium, from Plato's academy to modern universities, one thread remains unbroken: the pursuit of truth through reason and the love of wisdom that makes us human. Epilogue. The light that never dies. Today, the ruins of Hellas lie silent under the sun. The Parthenon still stands, scarred by time, yet radiant. Tourists walk where philosophers once argued, and waves lap gently against the shores where the first ships of freedom once sailed. But listen closely. The stones still speak. They whisper of Socrates, who chose death rather than silence, of Pericles, who dreamed of a city ruled by its people, of Alexander, who wept because there were no more worlds to conquer, of the countless thinkers, artists, and dreamers who believed that truth, beauty, and courage could shape eternity. Empires rise, empires fall, but ideas, true ideas, never die. And Greece, the small land of light and stone, still shines in every library, every constitution, every question that begins with, what is good? What is just? What is true? The answer, whispered by the ages, is always the same. Look to Greece, for there began the story of us all. The The sun sets over the Aegean. The sea glows like molten gold, and the broken pillars of forgotten temples cast long shadows across the earth. The world has changed, yet the silence of Greece still speaks. From the myths of Mycenae to the marble of Athens, from the cries of Thermopylae to the whisper of the library of Alexandria, the story of Greece was never one of conquest, but of awakening. Here, humanity first dared to look beyond survival, to ask not only how to live, but why to live. They built empires of stone and empires of thought. They sculpted the human form and the human soul. They fell to their own pride, yet rose again in every generation that remembered them. Rome would inherit their laws, Byzantium their faith, the Renaissance their dreams, and we inherit their questions. For every time we seek truth through reason, every time we choose freedom over fear, every time we create beauty out of chaos, Greece lives again. The gods are gone, but their echo lingers in our hearts, in the rhythm of our cities, in the logic of our science, in the restless courage that refuses to accept the world as it is. Empires crumble, kings fade, but ideas are eternal. And somewhere, beneath the ruins of time, the flame still burns, the same flame that lit the first mind brave enough to wonder, what is good, what is just, what is true? That is the gift of Greece, not its stones, not its kings, but its soul, immortal, defiant, divine. Empires. Historical, thanks you for joining this journey through the rise and fall of ancient Greece, a civilization that taught the world how to think, how to dream, and how to endure. And though their temples may crumble, their light, their logos, will never die. Empires. Historical, where the past breathes and empires live forever.